Today we'll be talking about the Second World War, and we'll not talk about the military aspect of the war. We will focus particularly on the home front. We'll discuss the economic impact, the social impact, and the cultural impact of the war. The Great Depression destabilized governments everywhere. Americans had responded by reinventing their democratic institutions. But in Germany, Japan, Spain, and Italy, racist and authoritarian regimes rose to power. These governments subscribed to various types of fascist ideology, the idea that a struggling nation could be revived only by a charismatic dictator who exerted complete control over the nation's legal institutions, education system, culture industries, and economy. Believing that war was a rejuvenating force, they also built large armies and eventually deployed them against neighboring nations. Great Britain and France unsuccessfully tried to negotiate with German dictator Adolf Hitler, and by late 1939, Europe was at war. At first, the great majority of Americans opposed US entry into the conflict. Prosperity was just around the corner, many believed, and involvement in another European war would surely derail the long-awaited recovery. When its troops entered into Manchuria in Northeast Asia in 1931, Japan became the first fascistic state to expand aggressively. Hungry for natural resources, the Japanese launched a full-scale invasion of the rest of China 6 years later. In the meantime, fascist Italian dictator Benito Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. Although the League of Nations condemned the aggressor, it lacked the will and ability to take action. The League's timidity emboldened German Chancellor Adolf Hitler, whose fascist National Socialist Party, or Nazis, had won a plurality of votes in the elections of 1932 and 1933 to escalate German expansionism. Hitler determined to use all means at his disposal to advance Nazism, a German strain of fascism that attempted to reconcile a conservative ethno-nationalism with the socially radical doctrine that individuals should be fully subservient to the state, which itself was embodied in a charismatic, all-powerful leader. Drawing on deep strains of anti-Semitism in German culture, Hitler held Jewish, whom he saw as an inferior race more than as a religious group, responsible for the Great Depression and other national wars. FDR in this context condemned expansionism. Like most Americans, he assumed that the Nazis were simply nationalists who, beyond unifying German-speaking peoples, did not have expansionist ambitions. Consequently, when German troops gathered on the Czechoslovakian border in 1938, FDR agreed to the British strategy of appeasing Hitler, thinking that the dictator's intention was to occupy only Czechoslovakia's small German-speaking region. Accepting Hitler's promise that he had no intention of a broader campaign, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain proudly declared that he had secured peace in our time. Appeasement failed miserably. In March 1939, Hitler's troops invaded all of Czechoslovakia. Soon afterwards, Hitler surprised the world once again when he announced a mutual non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin. The leaders pledged they would not wage war on each other, which effectively assured Hitler that if he went to war against the West, the Soviets would not attack Germany. Germany's state-of-the-art tanks and artillery invaded Poland with lightning speed on September 1. On September 3, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and World War II officially began. Over the next 9 months, Nazi Germany's war machine completed the conquest of Poland and took Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and most of France. 2 days after Britain and France declared war on Germany, FDR affirmed US neutrality. Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia had persuaded him that Germany had expansionist dreams and that Americans needed to prepare for war. But he also realized that popular opposition to entering the war, which many Americans saw as a potentially costly sequel to Europe's senseless and bloody Great War, made it impolitic to advocate joining the fray. Instead, the president reinforced the public's anti-Nazi sentiment and indirectly aided the British war effort. Congress feared the public's isolationism, having passed a series of neutrality acts in 1930s that aimed to prevent entanglement in another European war. The culture industries continued to stick exclusively to American themes and avoided direct mention of the war. Cruise ships still departed for China, the Philippines, Bali, and Java, ignoring Japanese aggression in those regions. And radio filled the airwaves with comedy and American country, swing, and light popular music. College students confronted the war head-on, staging mass rallies for peace, the appeasement of Hitler, and American isolation. Although FDR was legally bound to keep the United States out of the war, he indirectly aided the British and prepared Americans for war. The president had been waging an indirect, undeclared war on Germany for almost 2 years by the time the Japanese executed a surprise attack on the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. As Americans reacted with shock to the magnitude and audacity of the attack, isolationism rapidly turned to a trust for revenge. FDR now had a popular mandate and full congressional support for the war. In the fall of 1941, FDR believed that the war with Germany was imminent, but that it would take a shock to persuade Congress to declare it. Congress, still unprepared to declare war, nonetheless repealed the Neutrality Act of 1939 after the German Navy torpedoed 2 US destroyers, killing 11 American servicemen. US merchant ships began transporting munitions directly to the Allies. While accelerating US involvement in the European war, Roosevelt still sought a peaceful way forward in the Pacific. Japan, on the other hand, viewed conflict with the United States, which had imposed sanctions on Japan for its invasion of China, as inevitable. Aware they were militarily outmatched, Japanese leaders attempted to improve Japan's chances by executing a surprise attack. At dawn on December 7, 1941, 350 Japanese carrier planes departed for the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, where they carried out an attack that killed 2,403 Americans and damaged or destroyed 21 ships. Americans were surprised at the loss of life and the fact that the attack came on a Sunday, with no explicit warning. Even the most ardent isolationists now pressed for war. FDR immediately asked Congress to declare war on Japan. All but one lawmaker, who had also voted against US entry in World War I, voted in favor this time. 3 days later, the Germans, in a blunder that would return to haunt them, declared war on the United States. Congress reciprocated, and for the second time in 25 years, the United States was at war with Germany. In 5 days, the United States has gone from the ally supplier to active partner in a global war. Declaring war put sudden and immense pressure on the government and the American people. Millions of men and women volunteered to serve in the armed forces or help out on the home front, while the federal government moved swiftly to increase the military draft and convert the economy to wartime production. Conversion accelerated migration, particularly among black Southerners, as 27 million people left home in search of war-related employment. The war gave millions their first well-paid full-time jobs, changing the demographics of many cities and populating the Sun Belt, the generally warm region that stretches from Southern California to Florida. Waging war on a global scale did more to end the Great Depression than all the New Deal programs combined. Demand for war material lifted heavy industry out of the economic doldrum, taking with it coal and other extractive industries. Farmers grew 30% more crops in order to feed the armed forces and the Allies. By the end of the war, almost all industrial production was war-related, and business profits were double what they had been in 1941. Most importantly, unemployment had fallen to almost nothing. No other 4-year period before or since has witnessed such a striking recovery. The engine of the spectacular growth was government spending. By raising corporate and individual taxes and borrowing money, the federal government pumped an unprecedented $100 billion annually into war-related production, as well as clothing, feeding, arming, and transporting the armed forces. Wartime spending in turn created full employment for farmers and industrial workers, and robust profits for business. As soon as the United States entered the war, FDR appointed several business leaders to run key government agencies. The powerful War Production Board awarded war contracts worth billions of dollars to various industries and offered auto manufacturers and other businesses subsidies and tax breaks as incentives for converting to war production. To sweeten the deal, the Department of Justice suspended most of its antitrust lawsuit and offered to build new plants for the manufacturers free of charge. The proliferation and expansion of war industries accelerated urban migration. Rural migrants stepped into the jobs that the men drafted into the military had left. California's shipyards and airplane industry attracted over 2 million people, and many poor white Southerners flocked to the enormous shipyards of Virginia and the factories of the Midwest. By mid-1942, the highways were packed, bumper to bumper, as migrant families made their way to Oakland, Detroit, and other so-called arsenals of democracy. Many women were especially eager to step into factory jobs, from which most had been previously barred. The War Production Board and other federal agencies worked with business to recruit homemakers, and millions of other women quit their low-wage jobs for the wartime industries. For the first time, women, including 500,000 black women and thousands of Mexican-American women, became postal deliverers, bus drivers, and mechanics. and accounted for 1 in 3 of all workers. For many Japanese Americans, however, wartime mobility was neither hopeful nor just. Although the United States was at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan, the government singled out Japanese Americans as high security risks. In California especially, years of racial prejudice towards people of Japanese descent and other Asian Americans bubbled over into outright hatred following Pearl Harbor. Several attacks occurred, sometimes against Chinese Americans mistaken for Japanese. Despite a military intelligence report that people of Japanese descent posed no threat, West Coast newspapers began calling for the mass internment of all Japanese Americans. Under mounting pressure, the President issued Executive Order 9066, authorizing military commanders to designate areas in the United States as military zones from which any or all persons may be excluded. The commanders used it to carry out the forcible relocation and internment of West Coast Japanese and Japanese American population. Compelled to abandon their homes, schools, and businesses, 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated in remote barbed wire camps scattered across the western states. World War II was not just a war of production, it was also a war of consumption. Wartime conversion generated huge demand for a wide range of materials found in common consumer goods. Consequently, the government called on consumers to curtail their use of everything from silk stocking to automobiles. Household recycling was mandated on an unprecedented scale. Advertising agencies made themselves relevant by promoting patriotism, federal wartime programs, and collective sacrifice. All adult citizens were issued ration books containing stamps and coupons with which they paid for goods. Rubber was withdrawn from the market altogether, and the paper that books and magazines were printed on was rationed. Authorities forbade motorists to drive faster than 35 miles per hour and allotted just 2 gallons of gas each week per household. Long-distance vacations became illegal in 1943 when auto travel for pleasure was banned. By then, coffee, fats, meats, sugar, and canned vegetables were all rationed. Most of these foodstuffs were redirected to servicemen and servicewomen. Rationing fundamentally altered everyday life and made private decisions about household consumption an important public matter. The great majority of Americans cooperated with the new system and looked for creative ways to fill the gap. Many recycled their existing wardrobes, refashioning old wool shirts to make more fashionable items. Homemade clothing became so commonplace that the swing pattern business boomed. The system of coupons, ration books, and blackout dates proved complex and difficult to follow, even for the patriotic majority. And rationing sometimes resulted in rushes and long shortages, particularly of food. Millions of Americans went without meat. For example, in the harsh winter of 1942-43, because of widespread hoarding in advance of stricter rationing. Consequently, Mr. Black, as the illegal market in rationed goods was known, stepped up. Criminal syndicates printed counterfeit coupons or stole legitimate ones and sold them at a substantial markup. 1 in 5 legitimate businesses also looked for ways to dodge rationing laws, particularly in the meat industry. Although the government charged almost 15% of the nation's merchants with breaking the ration law, the courts treated most of them leniently, as courts were reluctant to undermine patriotism at such a crucial time. The war first threatened and then saved the advertising business. Initially deemed a wasteful, non-essential industry by the federal government, advertising enterprises faced the possibility of heavy taxation or even closure for the duration of the war. But the advertisers fought back, seeking to persuade the government that advertising was, in fact, essential. By promoting military recruitment, women's work, wartime rationing, and other government initiatives, advertisers won government approval. They understood that appealing to America's intense wartime patriotism was the best way to strengthen consumer loyalty for the time when peace and mass consumption would return. Advertisers worked through the War Advertising Council, a non-profit organization that consulted with the government and encouraged a war message in every ad. At a time when women were streaming into industrial labor, advertising forged new images of ideal womanhood that promoted the recruitment of women into factory work. The standard Depression-era image of highly feminine, stay-at-home mom gave way to images of physically capable welders, victory gardeners, and heroic nurses and ambulance drivers, all proudly and happily doing their part. Hollywood also eagerly pitched in on the war effort. The war presented Hollywood with a perfect opportunity to prove that it was an upstanding institution worthy of respect and official approval. Thousands of technicians, directors, and actors volunteered for military or civilian service. Director relished the opportunity to break from the escapist fare of the Depression and to instead make films about something as important and noble as the war. With federal encouragement, many filmmakers offered a nationalist vision of the United States as a diverse but unified society. Groundbreaking scenes showed diverse and racially integrated battalions, even though in reality the armed forces were still segregated. Irish, Italian, Latino, Jewish, and black men battled side by side. For example, in Alfred Hitchcock's popular film Lifeboat, a black serviceman helps disarm a Nazi in a scene that inspired hopes that the armed forces would soon integrate. Such films proved popular, although servicemen considered the depiction of combat absurd and preferred escapist movies. Box office sales and studio profits soared to record highs. Hollywood had at last attained the official acceptance it craved. But the industry had changed along the way. Movies on controversial topics such as poverty and racial and class conflict were no longer acceptable. Now let's move back to the war. Although victory seemed distant in 1942, FDR had already begun planning the post-war peace. During this early phase, FDR's vision of collective security owed much to former President Woodrow Wilson's idealistic internationalism. Wilson's reputation, which had suffered after 1919, revived as the cost of not implementing his original vision of international relations became apparent. Popular magazines, movies, plays, and books celebrated the former president's life and legacy, particularly his concept of the League of Nations. Although admiring Wilson in some respects, FDR believed that Wilson had overestimated his influence and underestimated the enduring strength of Europe's old balance of power system. Determined not to repeat Wilson's mistake, FDR abandoned the Wilsonian principle that defeated power should have a say in the terms of their surrender. Unlike Wilson, FDR embraced power politics and accepted that neither the British nor the Soviet would divest themselves of their respective territorial claims. The Soviet Union's stunning repulsion of German forces gave the Soviets new bargaining power. Conversely, Britain's increasing dependency on American armed forces put it in a weaker position. At the Tehran Conference in Iran in late 1943, the United States conceded that the Soviets could keep most of the Baltic states and large parts of Poland to create a security buffer between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Big Three also agreed to establish an international security organization and to manage the new world order themselves. FDR compelled Churchill to expedite Operation Overlord. From that moment on, Great Britain was the junior partner to the American superpower. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Big Three agreed to demilitarize Germany and split it into 4 occupation zones. All three agreed to found and join the United Nations, and Stalin pledged that the Soviets would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Critically, Stalin also pledged to hold democratic elections in Soviet-occupied Poland. In 1945, the president saw Britain and the Soviet Union as the only forces capable of ensuring international peace. Work was underway on 3 international organizations that would stabilize international relations. In July 1944, representatives from 44 nations convened in New Hampshire to establish the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which extended loans for post-war reconstruction and development and regulated global finances. Later, the Big Three met with China in Washington, D.C. to draft the Charter of the United Nations. The UN had a strong Security Council composed of Britain, the Soviet Union, France, China, and the United States, and a weaker assembly of member nations. The following year, the United Nations convened for the first time in San Francisco, California, and unanimously approved the Charter. As the Allied soldiers advanced to Germany and Poland, they found grisly evidence of Hitler's final solution to the Jewish problem, the systemic slaughter of 6 million Jewish. In Auschwitz and several other locations, soldiers found huge death camps, sometimes containing emaciated survivors. In addition to Holocaust, as the Nazi genocide of European Jewish became known, the Nazi war machine had illegally killed approximately 1.8 million non-Jewish Polish civilians, 6.7 million non-Jewish Soviet civilians, 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, and hundreds of thousands of gypsies, gays, people with disabilities, and others the Nazis deemed undesirable. After the war, the United States would prosecute the first ever international war crimes at the Nuremberg trials. sentencing top Nazi leaders to death for their role in the Holocaust. Dismissing Nazi officers' defense that they were just following orders, the International Panel of Judges revised the laws of war, firmly establishing the principle that personnel of any and all ranks may be held responsible for war crimes. Their ruling laid the legal groundwork for both the Genocide Convention of 1948 and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which provided that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Now let's move on to discuss the very last phase of the World War II. In the Pacific, victory seemed assured by mid-1945. Japan had lost most of its fleet in the epic battle for the Philippines, while US bombing missions over Tokyo and elsewhere had killed over 300,000 civilians and decimated the Japanese war industries. The Navy and Army were advancing towards mainland Japan, and FDR was hopeful that the enemy would surrender. But Japan continued fighting, its pilots even flying their bombers directly into US ships. Meanwhile, thousands of soldiers sacrificed their lives defending mere inches of territory. When the United States secretly tested the world's first atomic bomb in New Mexico in the summer of 1945, it was immediately clear that the country possessed a weapon of catastrophic and unprecedented force, and that it could quickly end the Pacific War. 6 years earlier, FDR had recruited Albert Einstein and dozens of other physicists, many of whom were German Jewish refugees, to develop the atomic bomb as part of the top-secret Manhattan Project. When the bomb was finally tested, its force shot debris 8 miles into the sky and knocked officials located several miles away off their feet. Exactly how the bomb should be used was a matter for debate. A scientific delegation urged President Truman to invite the Japanese to view a test demonstration that in theory would persuade them to surrender immediately. But Truman and the War Department feared that a misfire would be embarrassing and a waste of precious material. Truman saw many advantages to dropping the bomb. The aerial bombing of 1945 and the rest to end the war as quickly as possible had desensitized most policymakers to massive civilian losses. In late July, the president demanded Japan's unconditional surrender and threatened prompt and utter destruction if none was forthcoming. Japan remained silent. Finally, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thereby ending the World War II. To conclude, it can be said that the United States rode out of the war as the world's wealthiest, most productive, best armed, and most confident nation, a superpower. The war had turned the Great Depression on its head, more than doubling the size of the economy between 1939 and 1945, and producing full employment. After 1945, most factories reverted to peacetime production, but many continued to manufacture war-related technology and became the basis of nation's first permanent defense industry. Also, because of the war, the United States managed to assert its influence over international institutions such as the United Nations, and the country played a leading role financially, technologically, and culturally in the reconstruction of Europe and Japan.